My name's Chris Hadfield. I'm doing the Wired autocomplete interview. Let's begin. What, Chris Hadfield, in the search engine? Here we go. What inspired Chris Hadfield to become an astronaut? The first people to walk on the moon. When Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong walked on the moon on July 20th, 1969, I thought, if they could do that, I could do that. That inspired me. What was Chris Hadfield's education? I went to a bunch of different schools, but basically I'm a farmer and a mechanical engineer and a pilot, fighter pilot, test pilot. That was my education to become an astronaut. What was Chris Hadfield's first job? I grew up on a farm, but when you're growing up on a farm, it's not really sort of a job. It's just what you do every day after school. My first real job was working in a scientific shipping warehouse. When a school ordered scientific equipment, I was the guy back in the shipping department that would collect the pig fetuses or the weigh scale, put them in a box, and mail them to your school. That was my first job. What did Chris Hadfield find in space? Wow, what did I find in space? A new way to look at the world. What did Chris Hadfield, this is terrible English. What did Chris Hadfield learn from going blind? Well, I learned better English from this sentence here. During my first spacewalk, there was contamination inside my spacesuit, got in both my eyes, blinded me. What did I learn from that? Number one, don't panic. Panic doesn't really help, especially if you're all alone in space. And the second was, you need to do a better job of cleaning the visor of your space helmet, because it was actually the anti-fog on the visor that got into my eyes that made me go blind. So remember, if you're doing a spacewalk, clean your visor really carefully and don't let it get in your eyes, and you probably won't go blind. Emerging from below, as often scrolls on a computer screen, these are the questions that begin with where? Where, Chris Hadfield? Where does Chris Hadfield live? I live on Earth. Wasn't always true. But right now I live in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I like it there. It's a nice city. It's well run. Good place. If you get a chance, live in Toronto. Where was Chris Hadfield born? I was born about, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred yards from the US border, right on the edge of Canada in a town called Sarnia, Ontario, in Sarnia General Hospital. August 29th, 1959. Makes me a Virgo. Where is Chris Hadfield right now? On Earth. I'm in Las Vegas, baby. And what happens here falls on the floor. Where did Chris Hadfield go in space? I went around and around and around the world. We launch out of Florida. Or actually, on my third flight, we launched out of Kazakhstan, just south of Russia. You go straight up for a while, then the spaceship turns over, start going faster and faster and faster, parallel to the surface of the Earth, so that the whole trajectory of the spaceship is to go around the world. And if you can get going 17,500 miles an hour, 5 miles a second, 25 times the speed of sound, then you'll stay in space basically forever. You'll just coast once you get there. So that's what I did. Got in 3 different rocket ships, blasted off, went around the world 2,650 times. So I went on a pretty amazing world tour, more than Keith Richards, I think. All right. Oops. All right, this one, at risk of putting shadows on my face, says, when, Chris Hadfield? When? When, Chris Hadfield? Let's choose a verb here. When did Chris Hadfield first walk in space? I first walked in space during my second space flight. We were on board Space Shuttle Endeavour. We were building the International Space Station. Imagine you're wearing the most uncomfortable clothes you've ever worn. Like a big snowsuit or something, and gloves, and a hat, and big boots, so you can hardly move. You grab on to both sides of the hatch, and you sort of, like maybe a chick coming out of an egg. You know, you have to sort of fight your way out. But then you pull yourself out, and you're weightless. Let go with one hand, and you float around gently the other way, and suddenly you've gone from this claustrophobic little dark place to now being surrounded by eternity, where the whole world is silent next to you, like this big magic globe, but it's separate from you. But all around you is the 3 dimensions of everything. And it's perfectly black. It's unbelievable, like you've given birth to yourself into a whole new place. If you get a chance, go on a spacewalk. When was Chris Hadfield last space flight? 7 years ago right now, I was on board the International Space Station. It was 2012, 2013. It was so cool because I was up for half a year, so we went halfway across the solar system. Like we went from one side of the sun to the other while I was on board the ship. Pretty neat. Watched the whole world like swap ends. What was winter in the northern hemisphere became spring. Got to watch the snow and everything move and things start turning green the time I was up there. Okay, when will Chris Hadfield, small drum roll please, get out of space? I don't even know what that question means. Maybe people out there searching on Google, maybe they think I'm still in space. I'm still spaced out. Well, no, I've been back for 7 years, and happily so. There's no choices. We're all in space all the time. Where would I go? Space is all around us. Why Chris Hadfield? All right. Why is Chris Hadfield a hero? He's not. Why is Chris Hadfield important to Canada? I was the first doing several things. I was the first Canadian to do a spacewalk. I was the first Canadian to command a spaceship. I was the first one to use the big robot arm. And if you're Canadian, you're really paying attention, you'll notice the name of the robot arm is the Canadarm. So here's this great big arm with Canadian flags on it, out in space, being operated by a Canadian with a Canadian flag on his shoulder for the first time. Great big, ridiculously Canadian moment. So I think that's why I'm important to Canada. Why did Chris Hadfield retire? Because I got old. Look at my hair. Because I was never going to fly in space again. And once you've done all the things you should do as an astronaut, it's time to go do something else. Why is Chris Hadfield Space Oddity? An odd phraseology, but I did a version of David Bowie's classic tune, Space Oddity, which was a play on the word Space Odyssey. And I played it on guitar and recorded it on the space station, and lots of people have seen it. It's actually a really beautiful song, and David Bowie loved my version of it, which was a huge compliment. He said really nice things, which was great. Why is Chris Hadfield under the ocean? This you may not know. I lived at the bottom of the ocean for like 2 weeks. Because living at the bottom of the ocean inside a habitat, it's sort of like living in space inside a habitat. It's a good way to train for the technical stuff, but also psychologically. If you can't immediately come up to the surface, if you have to solve all your problems yourself, it's not a bad psychological training ground for being an astronaut. So if you see Chris Hadfield under the ocean, that's probably why. What? Chris Hadfield. Okay, let's choose a word. What is Chris Hadfield famous for? I think I'm most famous for, strangely enough, playing music. I mean, I'm an astronaut, I've done spacewalks, I was NASA's director of operations in Russia, I intercepted Soviet bombers off the coast of North America during the height of the Cold War, but I think I'm most famous for playing guitar and singing Space Oddity in orbit. I made a lot of effort to communicate with people using social media during my third space flight. I made a bunch of videos. If I go into any school around the world, they've been watching those videos sort of as part of their science classes. The ease of Twitter and such allowed me to communicate with so many people around the world, almost on a one-on-one basis. What is Chris Hadfield's favorite color? Blue, sort of a sky blue. It's a nice place to be. Color of my eyes. What awards has Chris Hadfield won? I won a lot of awards. In grade 8, I won the public speaking contest in my school. In grade 5, I won the posture contest. I was also the top test pilot at the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School and top test pilot in the U.S. Navy. The award that actually meant the most to me was, as I was a test pilot, I did this really complicated test to put a hydrogen-burning engine for a hypersonic airplane out on the wingtip of an F-18, and I presented at the Society for Experimental Test Pilots, big annual conference, and I won Best Project for being a test pilot for the whole world. And that kind of opened the doors to get chosen as an astronaut. Your life sort of trundles along, you hit a big watershed, and after that, everything after is sort of the result of one moment in time. Or that might have been the one I'm most proud of, one that had the biggest impact on my life anyway. What is Chris Hadfield's, it's a little tiny one, what is Chris Hadfield's, IQ? I don't know. But I actually, when I was a teenager, I was kind of insecure like everybody, and I wanted to join Mensa, the organization of people that had high enough IQs. And it turns out that when I did the Mensa test, my IQ was high enough to join Mensa. But then once I joined Mensa, I didn't really know what to do next. But at the time, it seemed important. All right. What languages does Chris Hadfield speak? I speak English, and then I'm from Canada, and so we teach French in Canada, et donc je parle un peu de français aussi. And then as an astronaut, I wanted to be able to fly a Russian spaceship and work with Russians. And so я говорю по-русски тоже. I speak a little bit of Russian, a little bit of German, but I've kind of forgotten all of it. How to eat in space, Chris Hadfield? Well, your food floats, for one thing, so you don't need a plate. Like a plate would be useless. So what you do is you get your package. You either make it cold or hot, and there's just like this little easy bake oven where you can warm up the package. You can't really cook. But it might be dehydrated food, and then you slide it over a needle, and you dial and you push a button, and it fills up the package with the right amount of water. Now you've got your package, and you mix it up, and you Velcro it to the wall, let it sit, soak up the water, and then you carefully slit it open. Because if you open it quick, you'll get like a little spoogey stuff all over the room, so you don't want that. So you carefully open so nothing comes flying out, because nothing's going to fall to the floor. And then you get a spoon. Spoon is a great utensil, and you want a long spoon so it can go all the way to the back of the package. And then you eat everything out of one package. You don't like have peas and meat and potatoes and corn. You just eat all of your peas first. And they have to be cream peas so they don't float all over. And then you ball it up super tight because you got to get rid of your garbage, put it in the garbage, and then you open your next thing, which might be, I don't know, a tortilla. So that's how we eat in space, one thing at a time in its package. It's sort of like, I don't know, eating on the bus or eating on a camping trip or something. Here's a funny thing about being in space, and that is because there's no gravity, that means that the stuff in your nose and your sinuses never drains. So it's sort of like you always have a head cold. You can't really taste your food as much. When you're like this, your food all sort of tastes bland because you're not smelling it. You're not getting it into all of your sensors. So food in space tastes sort of bland. And the food that has the strongest spice naturally in it is shrimp cocktail, because we put cocktail sauce on, which is a lot of horseradish. You wouldn't think you would have shrimp cocktail on a spaceship. With the nice red hot sauce on it, you bite into it, it's got that nice crunch, and then you get that surge of eye-watering horseradish cocktail sauce, and for a moment or two, it clears your sinuses. So my favorite space food was shrimp cocktail. How to sleep in space, Chris Hadfield? First, you have to decide when, right? Because you're going around the world 16 times a day. So when is it night? It's night every 45 minutes. Of course, you're going to get a sunrise every 90 minutes, so you have to cover all the windows so the sun doesn't get in your eyes. And then you float into your little sleep pod, and there's a sleeping bag tied to the wall with a string. You float in carefully, you float into your sleeping bag. It's got armholes, and then you can zip up your sleeping bag, and now you're just sort of floating like a fish in an aquarium inside your sleeping bag. You pull the little doors closed on your sleep pod. You turn the fan down as low as you can. Don't want to suffocate, but make it quiet. And then you shut off the light, and then you relax every muscle in your body. And your arms float up, and your knees float, and your waist bends, and your head comes forward, and your whole body's perfectly relaxed. And you don't need a pillow, and you never have to roll over. Your shoulder doesn't get sore. It's like the most calm and comfortable sleep you've ever had in your life. I think if we start flying tourists in space, it's going to be for like the space spa, the best sleep you've ever had. How to meet Chris Hadfield? Well, let's see. I speak all over the world. I'm constantly traveling. I've met millions of people. I don't just hide. So if you want to meet me, you could go to my website, chrishadfield.ca, I think, and see when I'm going to be somewhere. Or you could send me a note. We could e-meet. I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and such. Or you could write me a nice letter. I'd love to get a letter from you. And if you draw me a really nice picture, I'll stick it up on my fridge. How long was Chris Hadfield commander of the International Space Station? About 2 or 3 months. We take turns, and we go up in a little spaceship, the Russian one, the Soyuz. Pretty soon we'll be going up and down on American ships built by Boeing and built by SpaceX. But when I went, we took turns. There were new crews every 3 months, so if you think about it, we rotate who's in charge every 2 or 3 months. Okay, this is a big question, at least physically. How Did Chris Hadfield contribute to space exploration? Well, when you're the first to do things, people notice. Because if, say, for example, there'd never been a Canadian who was the mission specialist, which was like a fully integrated crew member on the space shuttle. I was the first Canadian. So that was sort of a big contribution for the 37 million people that live in Canada. Did a bunch of research while I was up there. I helped run the 200 experiments on the space station. I helped build 2 space stations. That's kind of a you know, with your hands kind of contribution. But I was NASA's director of operations in Russia, so I helped the space program, Roscosmos of Russia and NASA of the United States work and get along. So I contributed there. And I served as an astronaut for 21 years, every single day for 21 years. So that was a big contribution as well. This question is unnamed. It just has my name. I'm going to open it from right to left just for variety. Okay. The first Canadian in space, and now we have to choose the modifier. Was Chris Hadfield the first Canadian in space? No. The first Canadian in space was Marc Garneau. The second was Roberta Bondar. The third was Steve McLean. I was fourth Canadian in space. Very proud. Did Chris Hadfield walk on the moon? I never got the chance. And we haven't had anybody walk on the moon since I was 12. Soon we will. There are astronauts training right now, and we're building hardware right now for people to not just walk on the moon, but actually start settling the moon. Start living there, just like we live in Antarctica or some of the more remote parts of the world. So it's happening. So maybe I'll still get a chance to do what I dreamed about when I was a little boy. Okay, here's the next question. Go to space with, who did? Who did Chris Hadfield go to space with? I went to space with Russians and German and Americans, I think. But that's all just kind of arbitrary. I went to space with people from Earth. Okay, one more question here in the unnamed section, and that is Chris Hadfield okay? Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm okay. Part of what happens in space, though, is a lot of things degrade in your body. You lose part of your skeleton. Your muscles sort of waste away because there's no gravity that you have to fight. So your body gets lazy. Your heart gets smaller. Your balance system gets confused because there's no gravity. Some astronauts, in fact, their eyeballs, because of the change in the internal fluid pressures of your body, their eyeballs change shape, so they see not as well after they've been in space. But I've been back from space 6 or 7 years now, and my bones are dense. My muscles are strong. My eyeballs are okay. Everything seems to be all right. My balance system's good. So, yeah, I'm okay. Thanks. So that's a lot of questions about me. How about, do you have any questions about, I don't know, astronauts in general? All right. Oh, cool. What astronaut? Here we go. What are the requirements to be an astronaut? That may be changing right now because with Elon Musk and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and other companies trying to allow anybody who can buy a ticket to be an astronaut, or at least to fly in space. I think that'll be good. But up until now, you had to kind of really be ready to fly a spaceship. So if you want to fly a spaceship, what are the requirements? Well, you need to understand complicated things like orbital mechanics. How do you maneuver in space? How do you make things accurately work? How does a space suit work, or the physiology of the human body, or a little understanding of solar physics and rocket propulsion systems and communication systems and being able to reprogram the computers. And plus, it's an international space station, so learn to speak some other languages. And so there's a lot of requirements. But the fundamental 3 things you need are, number 1, a healthy body that fits in your spacesuit. So not too big, not too small, and healthy. Number 2, the proven ability to learn complicated stuff. So how do you know somebody can learn complicated stuff? Choose people with multiple university degrees who've proven that they can get a high score on a test or do original research. And then the third, people who can make good decisions. So we choose people who have had complicated jobs like test pilots and medical doctors, life or death, or people who've run programs. In my case, to become an astronaut, I didn't really know what to do. I'm from a country that doesn't have very many astronauts. But I looked at the astronauts of the world and the cosmonauts, and I thought, okay, everybody needs a university education. So I went to 4 different universities, and I did it all in technical mechanical engineering. And I thought, okay, I look at, Neil and Buzz and Sally Ride and everybody, and they have good, healthy bodies. So, okay, I need to keep my body in shape. So think about what I eat and exercise a little bit and keep myself strong. And then I thought, astronauts fly in space. You know, that's a verb. I can learn to fly. I just have to do it. So I started learning to fly when I was a teenager. I joined the Air Cadets. They taught me to fly gliders and then powered airplanes. And then I joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and flew a bunch of airplanes, eventually flew fighters. And so I was a CF-18 pilot. And then I went to test pilot school with the U.S. Air Force. And then I was a test pilot with the U.S. Navy. Then Canada had an astronaut recruitment, and they hired me to be an astronaut. So I guessed right when I was a kid. What is astronaut ice cream made of? You've probably tried astronaut ice cream. You bite into it and it sort of melts in your mouth and crumbles. It's like a block of cotton candy. I think ice cream, astronaut ice cream, is mostly made of sugar, like whipped sugar. The secret is we don't actually eat astronaut ice cream in space. It's not really astronaut ice cream. It's science center ice cream. Because if you think about it, when you bite into that astronaut ice cream, it makes crumbs because it's that hard, brittle, sugary stuff. And those crumbs would go everywhere without gravity. They'd be in your eyes, you'd breathe them, they'd be in the filters. So it would be bad space food. What is astronaut centrifuge? When you fly a rocket ship, because it's accelerating through the atmosphere so hard, with the big engines pushing you, you get pushed back in your chair, and you sort of get crushed by the force of this rocket. F equals ma, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. You got that big force, and you're a mass, so you're getting accelerated. And you feel that acceleration as like multiples of your own weight. And the big rocket motors can crush you in your chair with like 4 or 5 times your weight. And when you come back into the atmosphere and we're letting the air slow us down, you can get crushed like with 8 times your weight, which is really brutal. But how do you get ready for that? Well, what we do is we get in a little simulated spaceship, and it's on the end of this huge arm, and it spins us around and around and around until we're getting pinned against the outside of this little thing. And then we have to operate the spaceship and show we can do what we're supposed to do. This thing is called a centrifuge. Depending on how you operate your capsule coming home, if you mess it up, then you're going to pull a whole bunch of G. You're going to get crushed a lot, and you have to wear the result of your mistakes. So it's a really good reinforcing place to train. What kind of music do astronauts like? Astronauts come from everywhere. We like all the music there is. We actually disagree about music on board. This astronaut likes music that has a melody that stays in your head and words that mean something. And there's lots of astronauts who are musicians. We keep musical instruments up on the space station. There's a guitar up there. There's a ukulele. There's a keyboard powered by batteries. So when we're relaxing in the evening, or when it's somebody's birthday, or when it's a holiday, then we get together with the instruments on board and play music, just like you do on Earth. The next questions are where? Where, astronaut? Where, I think it's going to say do. No, where is? Where is astronaut training? Astronaut training for the United States is primarily at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, or just outside of Houston. And then in Russia, it's at the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center. But then we also train in Canada at the Canadian Space Agency on the outskirts of Montreal. And we train in Europe, in Germany, at the European Astronaut Center, which is just outside of Cologne, Germany, and then also in Japan, because it's an international space station, so everyone's got their own training. And that one is in a little scientific training town called Tsukuba, all around the planet, where astronauts feel the atmosphere begin. Well, that's cool. You're floating weightless in space. You turn your spaceship around backwards, because you're going around the world in this perfect circle, and you fire your big engine for like maybe 4 minutes, and it changes your perfectly circular orbit into kind of like an oval, where there's a low part and a high part. And that low part of your oval starts to just touch the top of the atmosphere, like if you stuck your hand out the window of the car, not going too fast. You can just feel a little bit of air pressure. But you're going so fast, you're going 5 miles a second, so even a tiny little bit of air really starts to slow you down. And when you feel the top of the atmosphere, the only way you can really feel it is if you hold your checklist up and you let go of it, and instead of just floating in front of you, it now starts to gently fall towards the floor. Everything starts to behave like a feather. And you're still kind of just hardly sitting in your seat that you're strapped into. But with every passing second, you start to see the effects of gravity more and more. And we sort of really call atmospheric entry about 400,000 feet up. We call that entry interface. That's where you start to feel the atmosphere begin. And if you look out the windows of the spaceship, you can see that it's starting to get hot. And as you come in, it gets hotter and hotter, and there's flames pouring all around until, if you can imagine that you were somehow inside a blast furnace, and the red and yellow flames are ripping all around your ship as that huge deceleration is causing all the friction and pressure and drag. That's what the atmosphere does to you a little later. But the early wispy atmosphere, 400,000 feet. Where astronauts hang out? At the space bar. Yeah, standard joke. Well, we have to live near our training equipment. So most astronauts live close to the Yuri Gagarin Cosmonaut Training Center in Star City, Russia, or the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. There's a few obvious favorite places nearby to those space centers where we go in the evening. There was one classic called the Outpost, which was close to the Johnson Space Center. And it had all sorts of sort of contraband paraphernalia, old astronaut pictures and signed pictures and stuff people had brought back from space and stuck to the wall in this crappy old fire trap of a building. Eventually, the fire inspector said, no, we need to be grown up about this, and the Outpost got torn down. But for a lot of years, that's where the astronauts hung out, at the Outpost. These next questions, by popular demand, start with why. Why astronauts never cry in space? Well, it's not because we're not sad. Actually, sometimes you cry because you're happy. And what I found, actually, it's such a rich experience that my emotions were closer to the surface the whole time. I found myself laughing and crying way more often than I do on Earth. But you can't really cry without gravity. Gravity pushes the weight of the tears down out of your eye. Well, without gravity, then the tears are not going to drain out of your eye. In fact, they're just going to stay in your eye until you can't really see properly. And then you need a hanky or something to dry your eyes. You know, if you watch the movie Gravity, I think when Sandra Bullock was crying, somehow her tears were propelled across the spaceship. Her tears were squirting across the room. I don't know anybody who cries like that. In space, tears don't fall. Why astronaut not use pencil in space? That's not true. We do. We use pencils in space all the time. Pencils don't care where gravity is. You can write up, you can write down, you can write sideways. So we use pencils all the time. We use grease pencils, because grease pencils are really tough. We use Sharpies. Sharpies work great. Ballpoint pens don't work too well because, take a pen and write upside down for a while. If your pen won't write upside down, like a lot of them do, then it's not going to be a good pen to use in a place where there's no gravity. No, I don't have a Sharpie. But if I did, I would cross out not. Why astronaut use pencil in space? A little bit of a caveman phrasing, but we use pencil in space because pencil work. All right, why do astronauts exercise in space? Being in space is the ultimate lazy existence. It's the ultimate place for a couch potato. You don't have to fight gravity. You don't have to lift a finger. You don't have to hold your head up. Everything just floats. Nothing sags. It's a great place to be. But as a result of the fact that you don't have to fight gravity, you can be super lazy. Even your heart gets lazy because it doesn't need to lift the blood from the bottom of your feet all the way up to the top of your head. It just has to push it through your blood vessels. Your heart actually gets smaller. Your muscles would waste away. You wouldn't have this big skeleton fighting gravity, so your skeleton would dissolve. So we have to exercise in space because we're coming home again, and we don't want to come back as jellyfish. So we exercise about 2 hours a day on the spaceship. We have a stationary bicycle, no seat, because you don't need a seat. It's more like a unicycle without a seat. And then we have a treadmill that we can run on, and there are big elastics that we wear at our hips and our shoulders to hold us down on the treadmill so we can run and pound away. And then we have a resistive machine. You can't lift weights because you're weightless. So between the treadmill and the bicycle and the resistive exercise, 2 hours a day, you want to be conscious of your own sweat when you're weightless. And so what we do is we keep a towel nearby. And if you're good, you can take the towel and just float it there in space next to you. And you work out for a while until you're getting sweaty, and then you dry the sweat off. And so your towel becomes sort of disgusting after a while. And then you just Velcro the towel to the wall, and the sweat evaporates out of it. It becomes humidity inside the spaceship. That's collected in the dehumidifier, and it's turned back into drinking water again on board. Your sweat becomes what you drink the next day. As long as you have a good purifier, it works all right. I came home the same weight is when I launched, but with 20% less fat. So 20% more muscle. So it was good. Came back kind of ripped. It was okay. And my cardiovascular was good, but I didn't keep the bone density up. The bone density in my hips and my upper femur I lost about 8.5% of my bone, which is a lot. And so you run a big risk of breaking your hip when you get back until your body goes, whoa, I'm back on Earth, and starts to build dense bones again. Why do astronauts go to the moon? Well, so far only 12 astronauts have walked to the moon. 24 astronauts have gone to the moon. A lot of them just orbited it. They didn't walk. It's not like a lot of astronauts have gone to the moon. But why do astronauts go to the moon? We went because in May of 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood up and said, we choose to go to the moon. That's why we went. It was a form of Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was proof that we could. It was to challenge the whole industrial capability of the United States. Like, why climb Everest? Challenge yourself, see if you can do it, make it part of who you are. But now that we've done it, why go back to the moon? I think now it's just like all exploration. First prove that you can do it, and then make it part of the human experience. Eventually, we'll go to the moon to stay and live, just like everywhere else. Why do astronauts train underwater? How do you simulate being weightless? I mean, sitting here in this chair, I'm being crushed down all the time. So it's a lousy simulation of weightlessness. Now, we could all ride in the back of an airplane and have the airplane push over and have us all sort of float for a second in the back. Or if you got the airplane going like this, you could float for maybe 20 or 30 seconds. And we do that because it's good for little short experiments. But if you really want to train like for an 8-hour spacewalk, you can't do it in little 20-second segments. So we decided a long time ago, let's train underwater, and we'll use the buoyancy of the water and then the weight of the suit to balance out. And then it's sort of like being weightless. It's not, of course, because if you go upside down in the water, the blood still rushes to your head, and you have the drag of the water. Moving through the water is way different than moving through the emptiness of space. It's like, imagine how big a normal Olympic swimming pool is, and then make it 45 feet deep. That's what the space station swimming pool, training pool is like. We call it the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory. All right. How astronaut? How many astronauts have walked on the moon? Well, it started with Neil and Buzz. It ended with Harrison Schmitt and Gene Cernan. So that's 4, and there were 8 others in between. Apollo 11, 12, not 13, because they had problems on the way to the moon, 14, 15, 16, and 17. So 12 human beings have walked on the moon. Brave guys. How astronauts communicate in space? We talk to each other on board the spaceship. And people are from all over the world, so you have to choose a common language. The majority of the International Space Station was built by English-speaking people and Russian-speaking people. So on board, we speak primarily English, but lots of Russian too, sort of in a mixture of both. Сейчас я говорю по-русски, потому что я был член экипажа на станции. So I had to learn to speak Russian because I was a member of a crew on board the space station. And the cosmonauts equivalently learned to speak English. But that's just amongst ourselves. We have to talk to Earth. So here's what you do. You grab the microphone in the space station, or you push a little transmit button on the wall, and your voice goes through the air to a microphone on the wall. The microphone turns it into an electric signal that then goes through the wires to a little digital thing that turns it into a digital signal, and then that goes outside of the ship to a big antenna, and we send it up to a geostationary satellite 2,000 miles away from the Earth, and it collects that signal from us and then redirects it down to a great big dish antenna somewhere on the planet, like the ones in New Mexico, and then they collect that little digital faint signal, and then they take that digital signal and send it through wires across the United States, and it gets to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where there's another little machine that takes a digital signal and turns it back into sort of an analog signal, and then it comes through a wire up to a little speaker that shakes the same way that microphone did on the space station and moves the air molecules, and they come across and goes to someone's ear, and they hear you. How long that takes depends on how far away we are. Sometimes we're on the other side of the world. Radio waves go basically at the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second. But that's still, 186,000 miles the world is 25,000 miles around. So if you got to go all the way out to 22,000 and back again, and maybe even twice, it can take a second or two. So when I phoned my wife from the space station, it would go through all of those links and then get, through the Houston telephone system, and it would ring on her phone. But the delay was so long that she'd pick it up and she'd go, hello? And I go, hello? But by the time she said hello and it got to me and I said hello back to her, it might be 3 seconds. And she always thought it was like a sales call and she'd hang up on me. So she actually got the numbers from NASA so that instead of it coming up as some unknown number, it would say space. So her phone would say, space. Oh, space is calling. And then she'd wait for me to answer. The next question is how astronaut come back to Earth. When you say how do you get back to Earth, the real question is how do you slow down? You don't want to hit the world at 17,500 miles an hour. We don't have enough fuel to just like fire our rocket and slow down. We couldn't bring that much fuel with us. So we just use friction. We use the drag of the air to slow us down. We just start to fall into the atmosphere, and then once we're in the atmosphere, it catches us, and then we fly the spaceship as carefully as we can to not have too much drag or too much heat, big S-turns all the way down to let ourselves get aligned. And then when we get close to the Earth, if your spaceship has wings, like the space shuttle, then you could land it on a runway. But if your spaceship is just a little capsule, like a gumdrop, then it would just schmuck into the world. So we have a great big parachute, or maybe 2 or 3 parachutes. And then you can land in the water, which isn't too hard. You've done a belly flop. Water can be hard, but water is a little more forgiving than dirt or rock. So you can land your spaceship in the water and then run the risk of it sinking, or you can have it land on land. And if you're going to land on land, you can use airbags on the bottom, and that's what Boeing's doing now. Or you can have little rockets that just before you hit the ground, they go and fire so that it slows you down just before you hit the ground. And that's what we did on my 3rd space flight. And the Soyuz has little retro rockets to cushion you. Or as the Russians call them, soft landing rockets. It's like Greenland or the Cape of Good Hope. You don't believe the sales pitch. It's a pretty rough landing. All right, last questions. How do astronauts poop? I don't think you're asking how we poop. I think it's how we use the toilet. We poop like everybody. Okay, I'm going to get graphic here for a second. How do you know when you have to poop on Earth? It's actually because of the weight of the poop inside you. It tells you, hey, it's time to poop. You know how sometimes you're lying in bed and you're okay, but when you stand up, you go, wow, I really got to poop. Well, if you're weightless, then your body's not going to tell you it's time to poop. So you almost have to learn this new sort of fullness symptom that tells you it's time to poop. You're counting on gravity because gravity's going to pull it away from you. And without gravity, even when you're done pooping, the poop's just going to stay sort of sticking to you. So we wear a rubber glove, and sometimes you have to like physically separate the poop from your body. But then taking the place of gravity to pull the poop down into the toilet is airflow. We have air pulled down into the toilet. It's got fans in it. So, and that works for the pee as well. So when you want to poop on the space station, then you wait till it's your turn in the toilet, because there's a limited number of toilets on a spaceship, 2 for 6 people. Go into the toilet. We have it sort of like a little closed-off area. Take your pants off completely because you don't want them floating around when you're on the toilet. And then you sit on the toilet, and you can either hook your toes under some toe loops so that you don't float off the toilet, or on the space shuttle, we had sort of like a little seat belt thing that clamped, like, imagine wearing a seat belt so you don't float off your toilet. But you don't want to float off the toilet partway through. It'd be a mess. Then you turn the toilet on, great loudest thing on the spaceship because of all those big fans to pull the air down into the toilet. And then you pee and poop just like you do everywhere. And the pee goes down into a sewage system that has purifiers and filters and gets turned back into drinking water again, just like on Earth, except it's not quite as personal on Earth. And then your poop, though, goes down and gets pulled inside a tank. It looks like a big milk bottle on the space station. When you're done, we use wet wipes because you don't have a sewage system, so you don't have to use toilet paper. Get yourself nice and clean. Everything goes in there, and then it goes down inside the toilet, and then you clean up for the next person. You put the lid on the toilet, and when the milk can is completely full of poop, then we seal it with these great big knurled knob dogs on the top so that none of the smell will come out. Then we store it down in sort of a cold storage area of the station. And then when one of the unmanned ships comes up, we get all the food and supplies and scientific equipment, and then we fill it with all of our garbage, including our solid waste, or our poop, and we seal that up, and then when it undocks, it separates from the station, and we fire it down into the atmosphere, and then it burns up in the atmosphere. So the next time you wish on a shooting star, think about maybe what you're looking at. I'm Chris Hadfield. Thank you for being part of my wired autocomplete exercise. I hope you learned a few things about spaceflight and maybe a little bit about Chris Hadfield, astronaut.